I was listening to an interview yesterday with two well-known ministers in America, Al Mohler and Ligon Duncan. And Ligon Duncan was saying how he had just read the testimony of a Muslim convert. And the former Muslim said that one of the things that convinced him about Christianity was how the Bible speaks about its heroes. How the Bible speaks about its heroes. And he gave the example of Aaron facilitating the people's sin at the golden calf. He said that the Quran papers over it and blames it on someone else. And I was intrigued, so I went and had a look. And sure enough, in the biblical account, as we know, Aaron makes the golden calf at the people's request. Whereas in the Quran, Aaron tells them not to and tries to stop them. And it's actually some guy called the Samaritan who comes and convinces the people to make the golden calf. And this Muslim convert said, I can tell which one is true and which one is false by its willingness to tell the truth about a sin committed by its heroes. We know the Bible is true. One of the reasons we know the Bible is true is because it is willing to tell the truth about the sins committed by its heroes. And we see that in this chapter with regard to Abraham. Last time the focus was on Lot, and we saw what a tragic life his was. He literally had to be dragged out of the wicked city Sodom by angels. We're told that the only explanation for his deliverance was that God was merciful to him. But in this chapter, the camera switches back to Abraham. Abraham, the friend of God. Abraham, the one who prayed for Lot's deliverance. And maybe we think, well, great, we'll go back to hearing about what following God is meant to look like. And not someone who's so dysfunctional as Lot. Surely Abraham will do better. Well, think again. Abraham sins spectacularly against God in this chapter. He puts God's plan in danger, if a human could do such a thing. And God has to rescue Abraham as well. Rescue him from himself. So Abraham has no more the ability to save himself than Lot does. And on top of that, the sin that he commits is one that he has committed before. A long time before, almost 25 years before, way back in chapter 12. A lot had changed in Abraham's life since then. But it seems that there were particular sins that he kept struggling with. And so right from the start of this chapter, we're being reminded about the ongoing reality of sin in the life of the believer. That as Paul put it in Romans 7, "For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing." But the good news is that the success of God's plan doesn't depend on us. And neither the opposition of God's enemies or even the failure of his own people can stop him bringing about his will. As we look at this chapter, we're going to see three factors in particular that led to Abraham's sin here. Three things that we can make a matter of prayer for ourselves that we wouldn't follow in his footsteps. And yet we'll finish not by focusing on us, but on the all-powerful God who isn't hamstrung by our failures. And so the first problem we see here, and that by God's grace we must try and learn from, the first problem is forgetting the past. Forgetting the past. There are, of course, some ways in which forgetting the past is a good thing. People can be crippled by things that they've said or done decades ago, sins which they have repented of but never quite been able to move on from. And their life is now one of regrets and what-ifs. Or people can live on past achievements. Perhaps they had a dramatic conversion experience decades ago, or God used them in a certain way. But the danger is that you can try and live off that, when past experiences are never going to be able to sustain you spiritually today. So people in both those situations, whether crippled by the past or relying on the past, need to hear the words of Paul in Philippians 3, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead. But in this chapter, Abraham forgets something that he should have remembered. And that's the fact that he had done the exact same thing before. It had been a wrong move then, and it was a wrong move now. The previous time, as I've mentioned, was almost a quarter of a century before, in chapter 12. In the first part of that chapter, we read about God's call to Abraham. It's such a hugely significant moment in the history of God's plan of salvation. And Abraham responds in faith, setting out, not knowing where he's going. But the second half of that chapter shows that Abraham had feet of clay like the rest of us. Genesis 12, verse 11, when he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarah, his wife, I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. And that actually seems to be a pattern in Abraham's life. A great spiritual high is often followed by a fall into sin. It happens again in chapters 15 and 16. In chapter 15, God makes a covenant with Abraham. It's one of the high points of the whole Bible. And yet what happens at the start of the very next chapter? Abraham and Sarah attempt to achieve what God promised in their own strength through Sarah's servant Hagar. And now this incident in chapter 20 follows hot on the heels of another spiritual high. After God himself had dined with Abraham, and Abraham had prayed for Sodom. And we can often be most vulnerable after a spiritual high. Maybe we start thinking, well, things are going pretty well in my Christian life, and then, whoomp, and we fall badly. And so that's something we want to pray for example, for those who just got back from camp yesterday, or those who experienced the Wales conference earlier in the summer. We're often most vulnerable after a particular spiritual high. But if Abraham had ever noticed that pattern in his own life, he'd forgotten it. And he also seems to have forgotten the sin that he committed in chapter 12, which led to Pharaoh taking Sarah into his house before God punished him for it, and Pharaoh sent Abraham away. And now, almost a quarter of a century later, Abraham does the same thing again. Again, he's in a new place. Abraham lived intense, a fairly nomadic lifestyle. And here he moves to Gerar. It's still in the Promised Land, but in the extreme south. Someone has commented that times of transition in our lives provide opportunities for temptation. When we're uprooted or facing a new situation, facing a whole new set of circumstances, it's easy just to go back to habitual ways of dealing with problems, and we find that our old sinful habits die hard. And we may be in a new place and yet falling into the same old sins. Now, there are some people who believe that Abraham couldn't possibly have done the same thing twice. There is such a thing, shockingly, as unbelieving Bible scholars, and they would see chapters 12 and 20 as two different accounts of the same story, which the author accidentally included twice, the author apparently not being too bright. Now, we don't need to pay any heed to theories of people who start with the assumption that the Bible is a human book, or just a human book, and look for evidence to try and prove that. And that theory doesn't really stand up to any scrutiny, not least that Abraham says here explicitly in verse 13 that this has been their policy wherever they went. So Abraham himself says in this chapter that it isn't a one-off. And so actually, when we find the same thing happening at a different point in Abraham's life, it just further reinforces that this is true. But the biggest problem with the idea that this is the same event, just accidentally repeated twice, is that it seems to assume that one person wouldn't fall into the same sin twice. But that's just not what human nature is like. we fall into the same sins again and again and again. That doesn't excuse what Abraham does in this chapter, but it does make it all too believable. Abraham has been here before. But had it worked? Had it made him happy? Had it honoured God? And when I say that part of Abraham's problem is forgetting the past, I don't mean he's forgotten that he's tried this trick before, but surely he'd forgotten the consequences of it. Which is so often the way with our sin. We forget that it makes us miserable. We forget that it doesn't give us what it promised. We forget God's grace in rescuing us the last time. The thing about the devil is that he doesn't have any new tricks. He just has the same old temptations, though sometimes wrapped up in different packages. And if you're a Christian, you know that doing what the devil says has never brought you true and lasting happiness. It's never honoured God. It's always resulted in regret. So don't be like Abraham and forget the past. When temptation comes, remember that you've been there before and that sin has never brought you joy. It has always dishonoured God. And if you can remember that, it will suck some of the power out of the temptation right there and then. So the first factor that led to Abraham's sin was forgetting the past. And the second is fear of man. A fear of man. Abraham and his nephew Lot were very different in many ways, but one thing they had in common was the fear of man. They both at times make decisions because they fear man rather than fearing God. If you cast your mind back to last week, do you remember how last week's chapter ended? Lot lived out his final days in a cave because he was too afraid to live in Zoar. Lot had lived a life where he was more afraid of man than having a healthy fear of God. And that life ends with him still fearing man. Whereas if he had a proper fear of God, fear of man wouldn't have dominated his life. But sadly, Abraham too at times makes decisions because of the fear of man rather than the fear of God. He tells Abimelech here in verse 11 that there is no fear of God in this place. He was criticizing those around him for not fearing God, but why did he do what he did? Because he thought they will kill me because of my wife. Now, Abraham is a great example of faith on the whole. But there are times when he acts in fear rather than faith, and this is one of them. Logically, it doesn't make any sense. Abraham has committed his whole future to God. He's left his homeland, trusting that God will give him the promised land. He's trusting the promise that God will give him a son. He's trusting the promise that his offspring will be like the sand on the seashore, and that all the nations of the earth will be blessed through him. So he trusts that God will do these massive, humanly impossible things. But then he turns around and tells a lie because he doesn't think God is powerful enough to keep him alive. When there isn't even any real threat level to him. You know, we hear about threat levels at times. What was the real threat level here when Abraham lies? The threat level was maybe yellow. And yet he's so fearful. He tells a lie to avert something that he thinks might possibly happen. But is he not similar to us at times? Most of us don't struggle so much with trusting God for the big things, but it's the smaller things we worry about. It's the smaller things that consume our attention and steal our joy. If we're Christians, then we have no trouble trusting God for our eternal salvation. We believe that He is powerful enough to forgive our sins, to take our souls to be with Him when we die, and then on the last day to raise our bodies from the grave, reunite them with our souls, and place us in the new heavens and the new earth for all eternity. We believe that. But at the very same time, we worry ourselves sick about a hospital appointment on a Monday morning. We spend days worrying about a difficult conversation we need to have. We worry about whether God will provide what we need for the next month. We're anxious about what might happen to us in old age. I'm not saying that these are all small or unimportant things, but if we're going to trust God for our eternal salvation, will we not trust Him for these other things as well? Brothers and sisters, you can trust Him. Indeed, sadly, at times we're so worried that God won't come through for us that we do things that dishonour Him in order to try and fix things ourselves. And Abraham's lack of fear leads to him dishonouring God. He tells a lie which almost leads to Abimelech committing adultery with his wife. And God takes both of those things very seriously. They're two of the Ten Commandments that are telling us not to do them. And yes, Abraham would later try and excuse his lie by saying that there was some truth to it. But he clearly says what he says in order to deceive Abimelech. And the gravity of what Abraham has done is shown in the fact that Abimelech is rebuked by God and Abraham is rebuked by Abimelech. And maybe that's not something we were expecting. Abraham rebuked by Abimelech. But there are a number of times in the Bible when believers are rebuked by unbelievers, rightly so, and this is one of them. Hugh Martin was a Scottish minister and a commentator of a previous century. He's got a commentary on Jonah, and he's got a chapter in it, maybe originally a sermon, entitled "The World Rebuking the Church." The world rebuking the church. Boys and girls, can you think of the story of Jonah and where Jonah was rebuked by people who didn't know God? Well, it was in the boat, wasn't it, with those other men whose lives Jonah had put in danger. And when they find out who he is and what he's doing, they say to him, "What is this that you've done?" They can't believe it. They realize more than Jonah how serious a thing that he's done. And the same sort of thing is going on here. We expect Abraham to be rebuked by God or perhaps by another believer. But the fact that he's rebuked by an unbeliever should maybe shock us. Although really, if we believe in common grace, we shouldn't be shocked. We shouldn't think that unbelievers have nothing to teach us. We shouldn't go through life saying, "I'm not going to learn anything from an unbeliever." Jonah was rightly rebuked by the men in the boat, and Abraham is rightly rebuked here by Abimelech. Just listen to the indignation in Abimelech's voice in verse 9, and rightful indignation. "What have you done to us, and how have I sinned against you, that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done." And then he adds, "What did you see that you did this thing?" In other words, what did you see about us that justified you doing this? And the answer, if Abraham is honest, would have to be nothing. The lie is wrong in and of itself. And unless God had intervened, it would have led to the committing of adultery. Our society might not take adultery that seriously. Many would still look down on it, but there's maybe a general acceptance of it. But if you want to know how God views it, look at verse 3. "Behold, you're a dead man because of the woman you have taken, for she is a man's wife." And remember, by the way, I've mentioned the Ten Commandments. Boys and girls, can you guess how far before the Ten Commandments this is? Well, this is about 500 years before the Ten Commandments. So it's a reminder that the Ten Commandments weren't things that only started applying when Moses went up Mount Sinai. The Ten Commandments, they reflect what God is like. God always tells the truth, and so we are not to lie. God is always faithful to his promises, and so we are not to commit adultery. And yet here God in his grace has kept Abimelech from committing the sin of adultery, and he now accepts his protestations of innocence. So both how God reacts and how Abimelech reacts, it shows how serious Abraham's actions are. But still, Abimelech, the innocent party, will only be spared because Abraham, the guilty party, prays for him. It's the reverse of what we would imagine, that the guilty party here prays for the innocent party. But at the end of the day, Abraham is still a child of God, and God doesn't choose the deserving. It must have been an awkward thing for Abraham to pray for Abimelech. But at the end of the day, he's in the unique position he is, not because he deserves it, but because God is gracious. And it's the same for us. And so we praise God for the true prophet and priest, Jesus Christ, who prays for us, having no sin of his own. But what a missed opportunity for Abraham. He sins before the watching world. The nations were to be blessed through Abraham. Abraham here misrepresents God. And he also, in verse 13, he misses an opportunity to tell Abimelech what God is really like, implying that God has made him just wander about aimlessly. I wonder what our conversations with unbelievers say about God. What do we imply about him? Do we make following him sound burdensome? Do we make following him sound like just a minor part of our lives? Just something we do because we've always done it. What a tragic chapter in Abraham's life. And it's all because the fear of man became greater than the fear of God. Well, then the third and final problem with what Abraham does here is that he forgets the big picture. He forgets the big picture. One of the big dangers when looking at the lives of Bible characters is simply to see them as examples, whether good examples to imitate or bad examples to avoid. Now, there's no doubt that is part of the reason we have these stories. At times, the New Testament does use the lives of Old Testament believers as moral examples. And so when we see Abraham's sin in this chapter, we're right to ask questions like, why did he do that? And how can we avoid the same sins? But we can't just stop there. Because the Bible is about more than moral examples. The Bible is about God's great plan of salvation in Jesus Christ. So when we come to Genesis 20 or any other part of the Bible, we want to be asking, how does this tie in with what God is doing through Jesus? Is this just a chapter that tells us not to lie? Well, it is that, but it's more than that. We need to realize what's at stake in this chapter. What's at stake, we could say, is God's very plan of salvation. The great Old Testament commentator Derek Kidner sums it up by saying, on the brink of Isaac's birth story, here is the promise put in jeopardy, traded away for personal safety. In other words, the events of this chapter take place less than a year before the birth of Isaac. Back in chapter 18, God had promised Abraham that within a year Sarah would give birth to the promised child. And that's what's at risk in this chapter. For all we know, this is 9 months before the birth of Isaac. It's certainly getting close to it. And where is Sarah? She's living with a pagan king. If Jesus wasn't born, there would be no gospel. If King Herod had managed to wipe him out. And it's the same with Isaac. if he isn't born, or there are questions over his parentage, then God's whole plan is derailed. But the good news, of course, is that that's impossible. God will ensure that his plan comes about, even if his people are unbelieving and faithless. God will ensure that his plan comes about, even if his people are unbelieving and faithless. And that is still true today. Now, of course, even to suggest that a human being could have killed Jesus when he was born, or stopped Isaac being born, that would rightly have many Christians saying, well, that could never happen. And it couldn't, because God's plan doesn't depend on human beings. But many of the same Christians who would be outraged to that suggestion will look around at the church in 21st century Scotland and say, we're doomed. Why? Because they seem to have begun to think that God's plan depends on human beings, and that human beings can stop God doing what he wants to do in the world. And so the great news of this chapter, then as now, is that they can't. The fulfillment of God's plan and the growth of his church can't be stopped either by outward attacks or by his people's own sin and stupidity. Jesus has promised that he will build his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And the fulfillment of that promise doesn't depend on us. He himself will ensure it. Abraham was so consumed with his own life and his own fears that he forgot the bigger picture of what God was doing. And we can be so focused on the negatives that we do the same. We see decline and compromise, and we speak and act as if the church is doomed. But if we remember God's promises, we'll know that that simply can't be the case. Theoraf Davis comments, there will be times that faith doesn't show up, but God will. Abraham, this great man of faith, at a crucial moment, he shows a distinct lack of faith. But that doesn't threaten God's plan one iota. Abraham's faith doesn't show up in this chapter, but God does. And that is our great hope. And so take courage from this chapter. Despite God's star man forgetting the past, despite him making decisions based on the fear of man, God's hands aren't tied. His plan continues to advance. And neither the raging of his enemies or the failures of his friends can stop it. Amen. Well, we'll close by singing of this great assurance we have from Psalm 94, verses 6 to 10. Psalm 94, page 222, from verses 6 to the end. So verse 6 there, page 222, down to the bottom, verse 10. The tune number will be 252, Stuttgart. We notice, especially the last two lines of verse 7, our Lord will not leave his people or his heritage disown. Yes, when we're under attack, perhaps by enemies, but also when we're in danger of messing things up all by ourselves. And we also sing in verse 6, blessed is the man whom you chastise, Lord. And at times we'll need that, and we need to be open to fellow Christians chastising us. We need perhaps even to be open to unbelievers pointing out some inconsistency in our lives, and not react against it, whatever source it comes from, but knowing that we are blessed if others would seek to correct us and to spur us on in the faith. So Psalm 94, 6 through 10, tune 252, we'll stand to sing praise.